In the Pacific, every Marine knew the enemy script a fanatical, suicidal charge on the beach. But imagine you are one of the first men ashore on Peleliu. The enemy isn't there. Instead, the island itself begins to breathe fire. Not from the coast, but from deep inside the coral hills, from steel doors that shouldn't exist. This isn't the battle you were briefed on. This is an ambush on a scale so perfect, so methodical, that you realize you haven't been sent to fight an army, you've been fed to a machine. Sound of a low, rhythmic hum of a diesel engine, mixed with the gentle slosh of water against metal. A single, clear voice begins, low and intimate, as if sharing a secret across a dimly lit table. Come with me. Step out of the present for a moment. I want to take you somewhere. It's just after 0800 hours, on the morning of September 15th, 1944. You're not you. Not anymore. You're a Marine corporal. Let's call you Miller. You're 20 years old, but your eyes are older, aged by the memories of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. Right now, you're hunched down inside the steel belly of a landing vehicle, tracked in LVT. An alligator. It smells of hot metal, diesel fumes, and the sour tang of nervous sweat from the 20 other Marines crammed in with you. The vehicle churns through the turquoise Pacific waters, and the sound is a dull, vibrating roar that you feel in the fillings of your teeth. You and your boys, you've heard the scuttlebutt. The old man, Major General Rupertus, your division commander, he's called this one. Rough but fast, he said. 3 days. Maybe even 2. After the pasting the Navy gave this little speck of coral called Peleliu, what could possibly be left? For 2 solid days, the battleships have been pounding it. You watch from the transport ship as the sky was ripped apart by shells the size of small cars. The island burned. It smoked. It seemed to disappear under a shroud of high explosives. The plan, as you understand it, is simple. You hit the beach, mop up the dazed, shell-shocked survivors, and secure the airfield. A walk in the park compared to the stinking, malarial hell of the Solomons. The steel ramp in front of you blocks the view, but you know what's coming. The final 100 yards. You risk a glance over the gunnel, and you see it. An artist's nightmare. The water, a perfect, impossible blue, is turning a murky gray, clouded by churned-up sand and the smoke of battle. Ahead, the beach, designated White Beach 2, is a line of pristine sand backed by a wall of impenetrable green jungle. But it's the sky that holds your attention. It's filled with black puffs of smoke anti-aircraft shells. But there are no planes. Then you realize, those aren't for planes. They're airburst artillery, aimed at you. A new sound joins the symphony of war. A terrifying, high-pitched whistle, followed by a series of colossal crump-crump-crump sounds as mortar rounds walk their way across the lines of incoming LVTs. An alligator 50 yards to your right vanishes in a geyser of water, steel, and fire. The screams are swallowed by the engine's roar. This isn't supposed to happen. The bombardment was supposed to silence the guns. This isn't the work of a few days' survivors. This is organized. This is accurate. The LVT suddenly lurches, grinding to a halt with a sound like tearing metal. The reef. The damned coral reef, sharper than 1,000 razors, has caught you. You're a sitting duck. The lieutenant screams, "Ramp down. Go, go, go." The ramp crashes down into the chest-high water, and reality hits you like a physical blow. The beach is 500 yards away. 500 yards of wading through coral-laced water under a perfectly sighted curtain of steel. The plan on paper, the one briefed in the clean, cool ready room of the transport ship, had you riding this steel gator all the way to the sand. The plan just died. You plunge into the warm water, your M1 rifle held high, and the sheer noise is overwhelming. It's not the chaotic, screaming firefight of a bonsai charge. It's something colder, more methodical. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a heavy machine gun from a concrete pillbox you can't see. The relentless, shrieking whistle of mortars that seem to be coming from everywhere at once. The sharp, distinctive crack of Japanese Arisaka rifles, firing not in a panicked volley, but with the chilling precision of marksmen. They are aiming. They are waiting. They have been preparing for this exact moment for months. You make the beach, gasping, lungs burning, half your platoon gone already. You crawl behind a shattered palm log and finally look at the island itself. And that's when you see the anomaly. The true, terrifying impossibility of it all. The fire isn't just coming from the beach. It's coming from inside the terrain, from a series of jagged, coral ridges that dominate the island the Ymerbergal. They look like a dragon's spine, and from 1,000 unseen caves and hidden openings in that coral, a storm of perfectly aimed fire is descending on you. The Navy's bombardment, you realize with a cold dread, hadn't flattened the defenses. It had just knocked the dust off them. The plan was for a 3-day fight against a predictable, fanatical foe. But as you watch a flamethrower team get cut in half by machine gun fire from a steel door that just opened in the side of a hill that shouldn't have a door, you understand. This is not the enemy you were briefed on. This is not the war you were trained to fight. Every instinct, every lesson learned from past battles, is screaming that this is wrong. This wasn't a defense. This was a carefully engineered slaughterhouse. And the architects of this place, whoever they were, hadn't just built a fortress. They had rewritten the very laws of war in the Pacific. And the question that burned in your mind, a question that would soon haunt the highest levels of command, wasn't how to win. It was, what in God's name have we stumbled into? Now pull back. Leave Corporal Miller bleeding in the sand for a moment and travel 8 miles out to sea, to the cool, air-conditioned flag plot of the USS Wasatch. Here, the war is not a visceral storm of noise and fear, it is an exercise in geometry. Men in crisp, clean khaki uniforms move markers across a colossal map of Peleliu, a map rendered in beautiful, deceptive detail. The air smells of strong coffee and ozone from the electronics. This is the world of the plan on paper, and its chief architect, Major General William Rupertus, is watching his masterpiece unfold. Rupertus is a Marine's Marine. Tough, decorated, but a man profoundly shaped by the battles of the past. To him, the Japanese enemy was a known quantity, a creature of predictable, almost ritualistic fanaticism. Their doctrine was to meet an invasion on the beaches, to hurl themselves at the landing force in a suicidal banzai charge, spending their strength in one glorious, wasteful, and ultimately futile wave of humanity. Every victory, from Guadalcanal to Saipan, had reinforced this belief. The plan for Peleliu was built on this absolute certainty. The first reports that trickle into the flag plot seem to confirm it. Heavy resistance at the water's edge. Enemy concentrating fire on landing beaches. To the men in this room, these phrases are comforting. They fit the pattern. Of course, the resistance is heavy. The enemy is spending himself, just as predicted. The first wave of Marines is the anvil, and the Japanese are dutifully hammering themselves against it. The casualty figures are high, shockingly high, but they are explained away as the cost of breaking that fanatical crust. They're desperate, one staff officer might say to another, sipping his coffee. Once we push inland 500 yards, they'll have nothing left. The center will be soft. This was the official explanation. A costly but expected frontal assault against a traditional, if unusually stubborn, Japanese defense. The high command was, for a few critical hours, trapped in the amber of their own successful history, interpreting every new piece of information through the lens of what they knew to be true. But then, the contradictions began to arrive. They didn't come in the form of a polished report from a senior officer. They came as fragmented, frantic whispers over the radio, the raw data from the edge of the abyss. A company commander, his voice tight with disbelief, reports his tanks being knocked out by fire from a fortified cave halfway up the ridge. A forward observer, trying to call in naval gunfire, screams that the mortar positions aren't on the beach, they're in the goddamn hills, firing from reverse slopes. Reverse slopes. That single, technical term was a chilling heresy. It meant the enemy had deliberately placed his weapons where the big guns of the fleet, with their flat trajectories, couldn't possibly touch them. It was a detail so contrary to established Japanese doctrine that it was initially dismissed as the panicked exaggeration of a young lieutenant under fire. The ultimate contradiction, the one piece of evidence that finally shattered the comforting official story, came from a low-level intelligence analysis. A young officer, tasked with plotting the sources of the heaviest, most devastating artillery and mortar fire, noticed something that made his blood run cold. He connected the dots from dozens of frantic frontline reports. The big guns weren't scattered randomly. They weren't positioned to defend the beach. They were concentrated in a complex, interlocking web. And the center of that web, the source of the most systematic slaughter, was not on the coast. It was deep inland, in the hellish, broken terrain of the Ymerbergal ridges that the pre-invasion maps had marked as little more than unfavorable terrain. He took his findings to a superior. The naval bombardment, the most powerful artillery barrage in the history of the Pacific War, had been aimed at the beaches. It had been a magnificent, terrifying, and almost completely useless spectacle. They hadn't been shooting at the fortress. They had been shooting at the front porch. The real enemy, the one responsible for the mounting catastrophe on the beaches, was dug into solid coral, shielded by steel doors, and had been left entirely untouched. In that moment, the map room of the USS Wasatch ceased to be a command center. It became a tomb for a dead plan. The Marines on the beach weren't fighting the battle the generals had planned. They were bait, unwittingly thrown into a trap that was orders of magnitude more sophisticated and deadly than anyone in high command had ever imagined possible. To understand the cold shock that swept through Admiral Nimitz's headquarters in Hawaii, you have to understand what Peleliu was supposed to be. It wasn't the main event. It was the curtain raiser, a glorified mopping-up operation. The entire reason for invading this godforsaken splinter of coral was the airfield, a single, dusty strip of runway that was considered essential to protect the right flank of the most important amphibious invasion in human history, General MacArthur's triumphant return to the Philippines. Think of it like this: a master locksmith is preparing to pick the lock on a massive bank vault. The Philippines is the vault. But before he can work, he needs to make sure the security guard in the hallway is neutralized. Peleliu was the security guard. The plan was simple: kick the door in, knock the guard out cold, and get back to the main job. A 3-day affair, a week at most. The 1st Marine Division, the most seasoned, battle-hardened division in the entire Corps, was assigned the task precisely because it was supposed to be easy for them. It was like sending in a team of world-class surgeons to remove a splinter. It was overkill, meant to guarantee speed and efficiency. But now, the security guard wasn't just awake, he was armed with a machine gun, barricaded behind a steel door, and had laid tripwires all over the hallway. The reports coming from Peleliu weren't just describing a battle, they were describing a strategic contagion. Every hour the airfield remained in enemy hands was an hour that MacArthur's flank was exposed. Every Marine casualty was a highly trained veteran who was supposed to be refitting for the real fight to come the invasions of Luzon, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and ultimately, Japan itself. The 1st Marine Division wasn't an expendable asset, it was the tip of the spear, and it was being blunted, shattered against a piece of rock that wasn't supposed to matter. This is where the collision between the plan on paper and the reality of combat becomes a crisis. The timetable was everything. The Pacific War was a war of logistics, a brutal calculus of shipping, supplies, and men. The ships that delivered the Marines to Peleliu were already scheduled for the next invasion. The carrier groups providing air support were needed elsewhere. The entire, intricate dance of the island-hopping campaign was choreographed down to the day. Peleliu was throwing a wrench into the gears of the mightiest war machine ever assembled. It was a 3-day problem that was now threatening to become a multi-week quagmire, bleeding men and resources that were desperately needed for far more important objectives. The mystery was no longer tactical, it was strategic. The question wasn't just why is this fight so hard? It had become who is the architect of this defense? This wasn't the work of a local commander throwing bodies at the problem. The interlocking fields of fire, the use of reverse slopes, the deep, multi-layered cave systems, this was the work of a military genius. Someone had looked at this island, understood the futility of a conventional beach defense against overwhelming American firepower, and had decided to change the game entirely. They had conceded the beach, knowing it was a fool's errand to defend it. Instead, they had turned the entire island into a fortress designed for a single purpose: not to win, but to bleed the Americans white. To inflict such a horrifying rate of attrition, to kill and maim so many Marines for a worthless piece of rock, that the American public and its commanders would begin to question the cost of the war itself. Back on the USS Wasatch, a new, grim reality was setting in. This wasn't a mopping-up operation. This was a siege, and they had sent an assault force to do a siege engineer's job. They were trying to kick down a castle door with their boots when what they needed were ladders, grappling hooks, and a whole new set of rules. A new mission was born out of that dawning horror, not in an official order, but in the desperate need to understand the new enemy. The objective was no longer just to take the airfield. It was to find the ghost in this machine, to unravel the logic of this new, terrifying doctrine before it could be replicated on every other island standing between Peleliu and Tokyo. But while one part of the military machine was being brutally educated, another was quietly beginning its own, very different, investigation. The hunt was on, not for a man, but for a mindset. The hunt for answers began where all military investigations truly begin, in the dirt, with the dead. By the third day, the beachhead was secure, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The pristine white sands were now a junkyard of shattered landing craft, burned-out tanks, and the grim, bloated shapes of the fallen, both American and Japanese. The cost had been appalling. But for the men of G2, the intelligence section, this grim landscape was a library of clues. They weren't looking for prisoners to interrogate. The Japanese on Peleliu were fighting to the death with a fanaticism that shocked even the most jaded veterans. Instead, they were looking for paper. In the pockets of dead officers, in captured command posts riddled with shrapnel, they searched for the documents that would give them a map to the enemy's mind. And in a blasted concrete bunker just inland from White Beach, they found it. A corporal, sifting through the debris, pulled a leather satchel from the hand of a dead Japanese major. Inside, amongst the personal effects, was a thin, rice paper booklet. It was damp with blood, but the ink was still legible. It was a field manual. At first glance, it looked like any other standard-issue military document. But as the translators back on the command ship began the painstaking work of deciphering it, a feeling of electric excitement grew. This wasn't a standard manual. This was something new. The language was different. It didn't speak of glorious bonsai charges or the spiritual purity of dying for the emperor. The tone was cold, pragmatic, almost academic. It spoke of attrition warfare, of bleeding the enemy, and of a concept they had never encountered before in Japanese doctrine: the elastic defense. It was the first clue, the Rosetta Stone for this new kind of hell. Imagine a boxer who spends his whole career fighting opponents who charge straight at him, fists swinging wildly. He's become an expert at sidestepping and delivering a knockout blow. Then one day, he steps into the ring and his opponent doesn't charge. Instead, he retreats, luring the boxer into the ropes, letting him punch himself out against a well-guarded defense, all while delivering sharp, painful, and debilitating jabs from unexpected angles. That was the essence of the elastic defense. The manual laid it all out. Don't defend the beach. Let the enemy land. Let his superior firepower waste itself on empty sand. Lure him inland. Then, from a network of mutually supporting, deeply fortified positions, bleed him. Don't fight for ground, fight for casualties. If one position is about to be overrun, don't die there uselessly. Retreat through a pre-planned tunnel to another position, and make the enemy pay in blood for the exact same piece of ground all over again. The goal wasn't to push the Marines back into the sea. The goal was to make the cost of taking the island so astronomically high that it would become a strategic liability for the Americans. This was a revolution in Japanese military thinking. It was cynical, it was intelligent, and it was utterly terrifying. For the intelligence officers, it was a moment of profound, chilling clarity. They were no longer fighting mindless fanatics. They were fighting an enemy who had learned from his mistakes, who had studied their tactics, and who had devised a perfect, bloody counter-strategy. The manual was proof. It was the blueprint for the slaughterhouse. They had found the ghost's playbook. And as they read, they realized the full, horrifying scope of what had been constructed on Peleliu. The ridges of the Umurbergal weren't just a series of caves, they were a single, integrated, subterranean fortress, a man-made mountain of death with veins of tunnels and hearts of reinforced concrete. The optimism was palpable. The mystery was solved. Now they just had to figure out how to fight it. But the most critical piece of information in that blood-soaked booklet wasn't a diagram or a tactical instruction. It was a name, referenced with reverence, as the originator of this new doctrine: Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. He was the commander of the Peleliu garrison. They had identified the architect. They had his plans. Now, all they had to do was hunt him down. Armed with Colonel Nakagawa's playbook, a grim confidence began to settle over the American command. The enemy was no longer a phantom. He had a name, a face, and a doctrine that could be studied and countered. The initial, chaotic phase of the invasion gave way to a methodical, brutal siege. The objective was clear, isolate, and destroy Nakagawa's command post, which intelligence believed was the central nervous system of the entire defensive network. Cut off the head of the snake, and the body would wither. The main assault was now redirected away from the airfield and aimed squarely at the jagged heart of the Ymerbergal ridges. The Marines of the 1st, 5th, and 7th Regiments began their ascent into hell. They called it the Dragon's Spine or Bloody Nose Ridge. It was a landscape forged in a fever dream razor-sharp coral that shredded uniforms and flesh, twisted rock formations, and sheer vertical cliffs. And every foot of it was covered by Nakagawa's guns. The battle devolved into a primitive, almost medieval struggle. It was fought with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and bayonets. A single pillbox, invisible until it opened fire from 20 yards away, could hold up an entire company for hours, exacting a terrible price for every foot of ground gained. The playbook they had found was invaluable. It allowed them to anticipate tactics, to understand that a position once taken would be attacked again from a different direction, through a hidden tunnel. They were no longer fighting blind. But knowledge, they were learning, was not the same as power. Knowing that a cobra is hiding in the basket doesn't stop it from striking. Nakagawa's genius wasn't just in the design, it was in its perfect execution. Days turned into a week, then 2. The 3-day operation had become a month-long nightmare. Casualties mounted at a rate that stunned even the most hardened commanders. Platoons were wiped out. Companies were reduced to the size of squads. The 1st Marine Division, the pride of the Corps, was being systematically dismantled. And the central objective, the hunt for Colonel Nakagawa's command center, was turning into a deadly dead end. Every cave they blew, every ridge they took, led only to more caves and more ridges. It was like fighting a hydra. For every pillbox they destroyed, 2 more seemed to open fire from a new, impossible angle. This is where the enemy's true genius revealed itself. The captured playbook was not the key to victory the Americans had hoped it would be. It was the first part of an elaborate intellectual trap. Nakagawa had anticipated that his doctrine would be discovered. He had counted on it. He wanted the Americans to understand his system because he knew that understanding it would lure them into his killing ground. He had created a fortress with no center. The idea of a single command bunker, a snake's head to be cut off, was a piece of conventional military wisdom that Nakagawa had deliberately exploited. The Ymerbergal wasn't a fortress with a single king on a throne. It was an ant colony, a decentralized, redundant, and self-sufficient network of strongpoints, each capable of fighting independently for weeks. There was no single nerve center to paralyze. Every pillbox was a brain. Every tunnel was a nerve. He had designed a system that was immune to the very decapitation strike the Americans were now bleeding themselves white trying to deliver. The feeling of hope that had followed the discovery of the manual curdled into a cold, grim frustration. They were the hunters who had been led into a perfectly designed cage by their own prey. They were playing chess against a master who had not only written the rulebook, but had built the board itself to his advantage. The horrible truth dawned: Colonel Nakagawa didn't need to be in a command bunker to direct the battle. His orders were already written in the concrete and coral of the island itself. His genius was baked into the very landscape. The Marines weren't just fighting 10,000 Japanese soldiers, they were fighting the mind of a single, brilliant, and utterly ruthless man who was, for all intents and purposes, already a ghost. The 1st Marine Division was broken. That's not a dramatic statement, it's a clinical fact. After 30 days of fighting in the meat grinder of the Ymerbergal, the division had ceased to be a functioning combat unit. It had suffered over 6,500 casualties, a rate approaching 70% for the frontline rifle companies. The survivors were hollow-eyed, gaunt, and suffering from a level of combat fatigue that doctors had never seen before. General Rupertus, the man who had predicted a rough but fast 3-day fight, was forced to report to his superiors that his legendary division was shattered. It was a humiliating, unprecedented admission. Just as the situation seemed to have reached its absolute nadir, the breakthrough came. And it didn't come from a frontal assault or a brilliant tactical maneuver. It came from a different kind of soldier, a man fighting a different kind of war. It came from the quiet, meticulous world of the U.S. Army. While the Marines had been bleeding themselves in the ridges, the Army's 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats, had landed to secure the southern part of the island and provide support. With them came a small, almost forgotten detachment from the Army Signal Corps. These men weren't frontline infantry. They were technicians, radio specialists, and cryptographers. Their weapon was not the M1 rifle, it was the radio direction finder. Think of radio direction finding as a form of electronic hunting. Every time an enemy commander transmits a message, his radio sends out a signal. If you have 2 or more listening posts, the hunters at different locations, they can each get a bearing on that signal. Where those 2 lines cross on a map, that's your target. It was a new science in the Pacific, often seen as a secondary, almost academic pursuit compared to the grim business of taking ground. For weeks, these Army specialists had been listening. They sat in stifling hot tents, headphones clamped to their ears, patiently logging every squawk and crackle of Japanese radio traffic. Most of it was useless noise, low-level tactical chatter. But they were patient. They were building a pattern, a signal print of the enemy's command structure. They noticed that while most of the transmissions were scattered and mobile, there was one signal, a high-priority, command-level signal, that was different. It was intermittent, heavily coded, but it always originated from the exact same grid coordinate. It never moved. This was the breakthrough. While the Marines had been physically searching for Nakagawa's command post, fruitlessly blowing up cave after cave, the Army technicians had found his electronic ghost. The signal was originating from a tiny, specific sector deep within the Ymerburgal, a sector the Marines had assaulted and been bloodily repulsed from half a dozen times. It was a place they had designated on their maps with the deceptively simple name, Hill 140. When the Signal Corps team brought their findings to Marine Command, it was met with skepticism. How could a handful of radio nerds in a tent possibly locate something that thousands of combat veterans couldn't? But the data was undeniable. They had logs, triangulation charts, signal strength reports. They had pinpointed the source of the enemy's highest-level communications to a 50-square-yard patch of rock. Suddenly, the war on Peleliu had a focal point again. The decentralized, Hydra-like defense had one vulnerability after all: its need to communicate with the outside world, to send reports back to high command in Tokyo. Nakagawa, the ghost in the machine, had an electronic leash. The hunt for the man had failed. But the hunt for his radio signal had just given the Americans a new, far more dangerous path forward. The objective was no longer to conquer the Ymerburgal, it was to kill whatever was on Hill 140. The information from the Army Signal Corps landed like a bomb in the 1st Marine Division's command post. It was a perfect, beautiful piece of intelligence. It was precise, actionable, and offered a surgical solution to a problem they had been trying to solve with a sledgehammer. The target was no longer a sprawling, amorphous ridge system. It was a single grid coordinate. Hill 140. This was the key. This was the moment that should have changed everything. A new plan was drawn up, one born of desperation and technological precision. It was codenamed Operation Stalemate 2, the designated successor to the initial, failed assaults which had defined the first phase of the battle, a grimly ironic name for a mission intended to break the deadlock. The plan was brutally simple. They would bypass the labyrinthine defenses of the Ymerburgal. They would abandon the costly, cave-by-cave clearing that had consumed the division. Instead, they would focus every available asset, artillery, air power, and the freshest troops from the Army's 81st Division on a single, overwhelming assault to seize Hill 140 and the valley surrounding it. They would sever the electronic umbilical cord connecting Nakagawa to his superiors. Captain James V, J.M.O. Shanley of the 5th Marines, a respected and aggressive company commander, was one of the officers tasked with briefing his men on the new assault. As he studied the intelligence, the maps, and the reports from the direction-finding teams, he began to see a picture that was far more complex and far more disturbing than a simple hunt for a radio transmitter. He and his fellow company-grade officers, the men who had to translate the clean lines on a map into the bloody reality of combat, pieced together the uncomfortable truth. They realized Nakagawa's genius was not just defensive, it was psychological. The entire Ymerburgal network, the elastic defense, the decentralized command, it was all designed to do one thing: to funnel the American assault towards a single, inevitable killing ground. Nakagawa hadn't hidden his command post. He had baited a trap with his command post. He knew the Americans were technologically superior. He knew they would eventually bring in signals intelligence. He had counted on them finding his radio signal. Hill 1